This week on Notsam Wrestling, it's a very special episode. We're winding down this entire decade and looking at the 2010s in review with my buddy Wade Keller. This is Notsam Wrestling.
This is Notsam Wrestling.
Introducing your host from New York, here is Sam Roberts.
Well, what a way to wind down the decade, huh? The 2010s coming to an end, and this, the last Notsam Wrestling show of 2019. Thank you all for rolling with us for another year. Hopefully there'll be many, many more just like it. It's been a wild year in the world of wrestling, though. We've covered a lot of it. And on Thursday, on the Thursday, Notsam Thursday edition of the podcast, we went through the people who I believe are the top 10 most impactful WWE superstars of the year. And some people thought it was ridiculous. Some people thought it was right on. Some people were like, you could have put this person on, that person on. And just about everybody was right. It's very subjective this year. There's not a clear-cut, definitive top 10, or even a top 3 necessarily. I think there's a room for debate on everything. But as we come to the close of the year, this is a very special one. This is one that only happens every, I'd say, 10 years or so. It's the end of the decade. So today on the podcast, because, we always end up having year-end conversations, but decade-end conversations don't get to happen that often. In 2010, there probably weren't that many people doing podcasts reviewing the entire first decade of the 2000s, because in 2010, there weren't that many podcasts. So, I would imagine in 2019, the world is very, very different, and so we'll take advantage of that fact, won't we? We're going to go over all of 2019, all of the 2010s, or as much as we can get to, along with Wade Keller from the Pro Wrestling Torch today. Make sure you listen to the whole segment, too. It's a long one because Wade has an exclusive deal to get involved. He does the PW Torch and has been doing it forever. And he's giving a ridiculous discounted rate to you guys listening to Notsam Wrestling. So make sure you listen. At the end of the segment, he talks all about PW Torch and what the deal is for you guys. So if it's not something you've tried out yet, you're probably going to want to take advantage, because I didn't even know how good he was going to make it. I figured he'd knock a couple bucks off, but I don't even understand how he's making any money at this point. Not really my problem. I'm really more concerned with you guys getting a good deal than making sure Wade is making a profit. I like Wade, but I'd rather see it go to you guys than him. That's just me. And I guess he would too, because that's what he did. Before we get to that, it is interesting that as we leave 2019, we're still on Twitter having debates with, traditionalists versus non-traditionalists when it comes to pro wrestling. But at this point, it's so been done. I can't believe, God bless Jim Cornette. God bless him, that in 2019, he has the ability to look at something, make the most predictable Jim Cornette take, and that's not an insult, that he could ever make, and everybody still buys it, hook, line, and sinker. This is what Jim Cornette does. By the way, I think it works on both ends. So there's this clip, GCW, an East Coast indie promotion here, Game Changer Wrestling, had a show on the night after Christmas, on the 26th. It was on the Fight app. I got it on the Fight app, actually. And one of the matches had this very, very choreographed back and forth segment. And that video clip, GIF, however people shared it, went out just as the clip. And I'm sitting there going, as I'm watching it, okay, at this point, I almost feel like the wrestlers that are doing it know that this is going to get under Jim Cornette's skin. So they're playing their role. We know, like in Joey Janela's last match, or in Leo Rush's last match in CZW with Joey Janela, when there's the no sell of the table bump off the ladder, before you do it that you're going to piss off Jim Cornette and people like Jim Cornette. You know this already. It's half the reason you're doing it. We're going to get a lot of buzz around this because people like Jim Cornette, including Jim Cornette, are going to podcast about it and tweet about it and be pissed. And then exactly that happens. And wrestling Twitter opens up as if this is a totally unexpected thing. And can you believe, hey, listen, Jim Cornette, there's different types of wrestling. And then Jim Cornette says, this isn't wrestling, this is an embarrassment to the industry. And it's this conversation that I've seen played out over the last, probably 3 years at this point, maybe more. It feels like every 2 weeks there's another thing just like it that's happening. And I say God bless Jim Cornette because he's figured out how to make a cottage industry of it. He's figured out how to make a business of getting under wrestling fans' skin and saying, well, this isn't the type of wrestling that I like, so it sucks. And instead of people being like, okay, this is what the guy does, this is to be expected, they go, hey, wait a minute, I disagree with you. And they start going crazy, and then the Jim Cornette fans come out, and the Jim Cornette haters come out, and it all lines Jim Cornette's pockets. So, God bless Jim Cornette. I honestly can't believe that people are still buying it and still falling for it. But they are, and I'm sure they will continue to fall for it. As we talk about continuing, we talk about the future. I think that on the Thursday show this week, it'll be, the January 2nd, I guess, is when it'll come out. I will probably do some kind of WWE superstars to look out for in the new year. WWE superstars that will be able to make the most out of 2020. I think that'll be a fun show. Also, make sure that on New Year's night, January 1st, you're tuned into NXT on USA because myself, Kathy Kelly, and Pat McAfee will be back. We'll be showing some of the best matches that NXT has put on display this year, takeover matches that have never been on USA before, as well as handing out and announcing the winners of some of those NXT year-end awards. So make sure that you're watching that on USA. I'll be there. I know a lot of you were watching, certainly. A lot of you were watching the Christmas night episode. Some people loved it. Some people don't like me on those shows. I don't care, luckily, but the ratings were good, so I guess that's a good thing. New Year's night, myself, Pat McAfee, Kathy Kelly will all be back in the NXT control room handing out some of those NXT awards. So, before we get to my nice, lengthy conversation with Wade Keller about everything that was the 2010s in wrestling and primarily in WWE, I do want to note that this conversation goes on for about an hour and 40 minutes. Over 90 minutes this conversation goes on for. And by the end of it, I realized because Wade and I, as we do, had talked our little jaws off about wrestling, that we had missed, and I do address it, but we had missed one of the biggest stories in the second half of the 2010s, and that's I would say evolution, but that feels very corporate of me. I'd say just the movement of the women's division in wrestling and in WWE as a whole. I want to take a second to talk about it now because we don't talk about it with Wade, but just because ran out of time. But I think that the transition between what women's wrestling was in the first half of the 2010s and what it was in the second half is night and day. And that has everything to do with the athletes that came through. That has everything to do with the fans that said, we don't want this to be a sideshow. We want this to be part of the show. As a matter of fact, in some instances, we want this to be the main event of the show. This is the match we're here to see. And we get to the point where at the 2019 WrestleMania, you had a women's main event that wasn't the main event because it was a women's match. It was the main event because that was the match that the most people wanted to see. Leading into Survivor Series of 2018, the match people were most excited about was Becky Lynch versus Ronda Rousey. And it's not just Ronda Rousey. You could sit there and go okay, well, you had a star as big as Ronda Rousey show up at the Royal Rumble 2018. What do you expect's going to happen? But that's not true. It's not just Ronda Rousey. It's the fact that somebody like Charlotte burst onto the scene. I think she showed up in NXT in 2013, but I would say around 2015. is when she really started to make a name for herself and turn into somebody that you look at and say, this is an all-timer. This is a marquee performer. You look at what Becky Lynch over the last 2 years has evolved into. You look at performers like Sasha Banks, I've said it 100 times. Then you can factor in the Ronda Rouseys of the world. You can factor in the fact that the WWE decided to do an all-women's pay-per-view at one point, and not only was it successful, but it's got a lot of people asking for another one and asking for it to be an annual tradition. The WWE announces a women's Royal Rumble match, and it goes so well it becomes part of the tradition. A women's Elimination Chamber match, and it goes so well it becomes part of the tradition. Women main eventing multiple pay-per-views. Women having a Hell in a Cell match becomes the norm. Women in a TLC match. Women in a Money in the Bank ladder match. Every tradition normally reserved for men by the end of the 2010s has been also afforded to the women, finally. And I think it's an amazing thing. I also think athletes like Asuka should be mentioned when we talk about everybody. And there's a lot of people that I'm forgetting. But, I think that it's tough doing a full decade-long conversation because you have to take the entire 10 years into account. And the fact is that in 2010, we were still very deep into the divas division. The idea of the women being divas, it wasn't even an insulting thing. This is where it was. You got to talk about the Bella Twins and their ability to evolve. I mean, they were the centerpiece of the divas division, and they were able to evolve and hang in there as the women's evolution took place. And had they not decided it was time to go, the Bella Twins would still fit in with what's going on in current day WWE. But the women's evolution continues to happen. It continues to evolve. And that story isn't being done. But the 2010s will certainly be the decade when that story started. The second half of the 2010s, one of, if not the top historical story, has to be what the women in the WWE did, continue to do, and what fans are looking for. And the fact that WWE is answering to that. You can go outside of WWE and see that what's going on the independent level, that this is also transpiring there, that there's more and more women's wrestling going on independent shows, which a lot of independent shows wouldn't have women's wrestling at all. Intergender wrestling became a thing in this decade that wasn't so much intended to be, again, a sideshow, that wasn't, about stacking the odds against the woman, but actually creating scenarios where you're having competitive matches with men and women. And I actually think that it's a good thing. I think it does equalize things quite a bit. So I'm glad that we get a chance to talk about that. There's a whole lot to talk about with the 2010s and everything that was. So let's bring in Wade Keller. Let's do it. Let's talk about the 2010s and WWE.
The Not Sam Wrestling interview.
So as we approach the finale of another decade of pro wrestling and WWE and whatever wrestling you all are watching, I thought it would be fun to recap the entire decade, and I couldn't think of anybody better to have just a conversation. There's not that many people I can think of that I could reliably say, hey, do you want to have a spontaneous conversation about the last decade of wrestling and have any sort of informative confidence in them? But I do in our guest this week. Wade Keller's back on the show. What's going on, Wade?
Just, trying to figure out what day of the week it is. I'm so regimented, and in my life, it's like to get everything done that needs to get done, I need to know what day of the week it is and be in a pattern. And Christmas in the middle of the week, New Year's coming up. I can't keep track of anything. There's wrestling, but it's not as much. But then there it is again. It's been a while, but it's actually been a really fun week. I really enjoyed the holidays and got to see some relatives I haven't seen in a while. So yeah, it's been fun. But yeah, I'm excited to talk wrestling.
I'm the exact same way. Like, throughout this week, I've been like, oh, wait. SmackDown is on tonight. Like, okay, it's Friday. Like, just trying, when your schedule gets out of whack, especially, when you're like, I guess either one of us that has just days that are chock full of everything you can possibly get into them. The minute you start to slow down is when everything just goes like, wait, I'm confused. I don't understand what's going on anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's for people who aren't like us and they live more sane, normal, relaxed lives. It's like it might not make sense, but I completely am in sync with you as far as needing things to be in sync.
And then I think it fits into our conversation today because on a sort of macro level, when I started going down like, okay, like what am I going to do for podcasts over the next couple weeks, the holidays, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, I'll do a 2019 in review podcast. And I didn't even realize until I was kind of mapping stuff out, oh, like this is the close of a decade. I can't believe, I can't believe that another decade of wrestling has gone by. I mean, I think about like the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, but I can't believe that we're now entering into that third decade of the 2000s.
I can't believe that it's 2020. When I was growing up, I'm like, how old will I be when it's 2020? That's so far off, and now like here it is. I mean, we all felt that way if we're old enough about the year 2000.
Mm-hmm.
But like 2020 for some reason seems like so much further off to me always, and then here we are.
Here we are.
Although I'm kind of, it's fun to be able to say the 20s and not stumble and go, was it the teens? Is it the 10s?
Yeah.
Is it the second decade of the millennium? Like, how do we talk about it? It's a little easier than the aughts or the ones or the 2000s, whatever we call the first 10 years. But now we've got past this 20 years of indecision and hesitation. It's the 20s.
It's the 20s. Yeah, and I mean, I think if you go back, you've got a pretty clear picture of when you think about wrestling, like what the 80s look like, what the 90s look like, what the 2000s look like. What do you think the 2010s are going to be remembered for? Because I've been thinking about this, and I've got my sort of thought, and it's always kind of different. At the very end of the decade, it's pretty difficult to really kind of give yourself a clear picture because it's impossible for us to completely stand back and look at the decade as its own entity because, we're still in it. It's still really, really fresh. But I know what I think, and I'll tell you. But what do you think the 2010s, like the sort of overarching, I don't know, story or theme or defining thing is for wrestling in the 2010s?
I think the corporatization of professional wrestling, overcoming in WWE in particular, obviously, WWE overcoming what was a tawdry, controversial, stained image in the 1990s and 2000s, with John Cena as the face of the brand, the clean-cut, smiling, safe for your television set in your living room, leading star. And WWE, although they went public, roughly 10 years earlier,
Mm-hmm.
really cementing themselves as a main. I mean, this is what Vince McMahon always dreamed of. He talked in the 80s about wanting to be the Walt Disney of professional wrestling. For WWE to become the dominant brand, but then the new frontier, or the other frontier, the one that Vince McMahon strived for even more so was, and people who are just become fans in the last 10 or 15 years, it's hard to really understand how much or fully comprehend how important this of an achievement this was to Vince McMahon, given where his company was at different times in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, to just be embraced and accepted by sponsors, by the top cable networks, and to end the decade being embraced by Fox Broadcast. Certainly it doesn't mean what it did in 1990 to be on Fox Broadcast Network, because the TV industry is changing. But to me, that's the big overriding arc of this last 10 years.
Yeah, it was almost like there was this goal that maybe we as fans couldn't quite wrap our heads around, because all we as fans are really interested in is the day in, day out creative of the show. Is this a fun show? Do I like this show? I wish this character was doing that. We don't really, as fans, pay attention. I mean, as journalists you might, but as fans you don't pay attention to the big picture of the business and where you want this business to go, because it's not our concern, it's their concern. But I think you're 100% right that you look at all the moves that were made, especially in the last 10 years, and it really is pretty remarkable that they're as close to being a Disney-type company as they've ever been.
And it took work.
Yeah, a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, the place that WWE is at in terms of when someone says WWE now, and there's a certain generation of people who aren't fans but are old enough who still say WWF, and we all kind of chuckle or snicker a little bit. It's like, it's been 20 years almost.
I know.
But
It's always going to be WWF to me. It's all right. Well, you got to get
Yeah.
past it. Like, I don't even know what to talk to you about anymore. None of those guys are anywhere near the product. Like,
yeah, it's getting to the point where it's like talking about certain football teams as being AFL teams. It's like, nope, it's been the NFL for a long time.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the job that I do in covering professional wrestling as a journalist and reporting on it and covering the business side of it since I started doing this, like that's still, as much as I'm watching wrestling and reacting to what happens on TV in the ring, I still see it so much of when I step back, not the immersive week to week shows, but when I step back and look at things, that it's like almost a no brainer that for the dominance of, I mean, look at what it was almost 10 years ago. Well, it was 10 years ago when Impact tried to go head to head with Raw. I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy. And that stopped, in 2010, like that they pulled back and went back to Thursday. So there was an attempt to compete with WWE. And I think the symbolism of here we are almost 10 years later, and it's just been only WWE until the very end here this fall. It was the decade of WWE. And again, I say this parenthetically, but I think it's worth noting for fans who just think, well, isn't pro wrestling WWE? I mean, we know there's other groups out there in other countries and small ones. It's like, no, this was a diverse business in terms of how many promoters. And, when I would create wrestling's most powerful list in the 90s in my yearbooks, there were people from all different companies. It wasn't, usually Vince McMahon was on top, but not always. Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan topped the list. But there were always other companies. And going back to when I first started covering wrestling in the 80s, yes, WWF was the biggest at that point, but it wasn't there were other territories and other businesses competing. And it's the last 10 years by far was WWE domination, and really nobody with the money or the creative force to compete with them. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that happened over the last 10 years is the way WWE handled and reacted to that fact that they were, on a national scale and an international scale, they were the picture of professional wrestling. You know what I mean? You have, like you said, there were other people doing it, smaller people. Of course, New Japan was over here, and Impact, at various parts of the decade were on various levels, and even Ring of Honor was strong at one point and not so strong at another point. But you're right, up until this last year, especially in America, but globally, nothing came even close to the WWE. And I think the WWE Network is probably the biggest thing to come out of this decade for the WWE, not just because it changed the way people watch wrestling and you look, and everybody has a network now after that. Everybody, and I think it's actually been a really good thing. The Fight TVs of the world and the independent wrestling networks of the world, all these kind of companies that were like, oh, well, we can also have a wrestling network because now WWE has normalized streaming. They've mainstreamed streaming on a network that you pay for. And it's made it so all these independent companies that normally would be limited to eyes in the building, 200 eyes, 500 eyes, however many, sets of eyes they have on them at any given moment, now can be a part of this thing. And, they're not going to have millions of people watching them, but instead of 200 people in a building, they can have 1,500 people watching them. And all of a sudden, you've got a huge multiple of your fan base going up. I also think that the WWE Network made it so that we started to get this picture of WWE not being Monday Night Raw, right? I think that before this decade, WWE was a show. I'm going to a WWE show, I'm watching WWE on TV. I think that the network and everything around the network really helped drive the point home that WWE is this great big company. It includes Raw, it includes SmackDown, it includes NXT. It also includes WCW. It also includes ECW. WWE is this company that includes all of the pro wrestling that you've known for the last, 50 years or however long it's been. I think all of that helped paint this picture that we now just take for granted, that up until a year ago, and you could still make the argument that for the vast majority it remains to be true, that WWE is pro wrestling.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, and what WWE did with that to try to keep up on the business side, with WWE Network, and then spending so many years. I mean, there were some WrestleManias where it felt like there was a show for the fans, and then there was this other show going on for the corporate partners and the corporate suites, which is, look at the charity work we do. Look at the mainstream coverage we're getting, the era of Raw guest hosts. There was this really concerted effort to mainstream pro wrestling and redefine it as sports entertainment and get the WWE brand over as just part of Americana, part of it's a Vince McMahon term, Americana, part of pop culture, and then to cash in on it. And that first TV deal that came in short of what they were hoping for, then got that was a letdown, and then they just doubled down. And then this last TV deal was everything they hoped for and more. And so when you end the decade, I think you look at, we talk about where WWE is relative, dominating the industry. It's just WWE's financial positioning is a huge story. It's not it's an end point to the decade, which is how financially strong they are with the money coming in from the new TV deals and from WWE Network and from Saudi Arabia. The diminishing importance of house shows, and to a degree the diminishing importance of TV ratings, although that's a controversial topic because they wouldn't have this huge TV deal if they weren't still, despite all the ways to watch WWE outside of linear cable or DVR recorded off of linear cable. That's where a huge chunk of their money comes from, and they need to sustain that. But nevertheless, it's less important to their certainly survival and even thriving than it was, and it was part of a very concerted corporate effort to fill the TV shows with so much content about WWE, the brand. Here's what we stand for. Here's what we're doing outside of the ring. And please look at us as a safe place for advertisers. And 20 years ago, that was not the case. It was 20 years ago this month that they were dealing with some issues with corporate sponsors over content on Raw during the Attitude Era. And it was, they were panicked about the fact that they were going to lose some sponsors and be seen as a company that you don't want to be associated with. And I think that stuck with Vince McMahon, and it's embedded in the DNA of the culture, which is there's so much money to be made if we can just stay out of the controversial headlines and be a PG product that is seen as a corporation bringing smiles to people's faces and doing good charity work, and it paid off, and they're reaping the benefits.
Before we go too much further, reminiscing about the last 10 years with Wade Keller, let's think about the present, and let's think about the future, and let's think about all the ways that you can support Notsam Wrestling. Of course, the simplest thing is going over to iTunes, leaving that 5-star review and 5-star rating and a nice review. Helps every single time, more than you could possibly know. But what I would love for you to do is hit up youtube.com/NotSamWrestling. Hit the subscribe button, follow us there. In 2020, we are moving all of our YouTube content. That's all the State of Wrestling snippets. That's every podcast that we put out. That's every interview in video form. It's all going over from the Notsam YouTube channel to youtube.com/NotSamWrestling. And I want to make sure that you're all signed up and subscribed so you see everything that we have to offer. We're a brand new YouTube channel over there. And I want it to be a hub for all of the wrestling content that we pump out here so that you can just go to the channel and see everything you want to see when it comes to pro wrestling, and yours truly, the last professional broadcaster. Last but certainly not least, if you want to spend a couple bucks, patreon.com/NotSamWrestling, starting for less than $1 a week, $4 a month, you can become a money mark, and you can have access to every show that we do early and ad-free. You won't have to hear this part of the show, and you'll have access to the Discord room, which is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and has Notsam Wrestling fans in there all the time, talking wrestling, talking everything else. They just got over their Secret Santa. It's an amazing community. Become a part of it. Become a Notsam shill at patreon.com/NotSamWrestling. So there you have it. Leave us a rating. Leave us a review. Go to youtube.com/NotSamWrestling. Subscribe and watch those videos for free. And if you still want to do more, become a shill at patreon.com/NotSamWrestling. Yeah, I also think that you hit on something really important, which is that the WWE has figured out all these new revenue streams to open up, where they're looking. WWE has always been a very forward-thinking company. That's one thing that they've done extremely well, and I think that's why they've survived as long as they've had in an industry that is not built. Wrestling, I don't think, has ever been built to survive long-term on the scale that WWE is at. And the fact that they've survived and are not only surviving but thriving still, I think, is because that they've figured out, like, okay, if attendance goes down, we need to not go, oh, we need to get attendance up. We need to figure out, not only do we get attendance up, but how do we make money over here? Okay, well, then how do we make money over there? Okay, TV ratings are down, but TV ratings are down all the board. So how do we make up the income that we were relying on television? And you see companies, I mean, think about, I think about it the way I look at these stores. I think in the 2010s, to see Sears and Kmart and Toys R Us and all these big box stores that were just, indestructible foundations of the American economy, and to see malls, complete full malls, that at one point were fueling the local economy of whatever city they were in, to see all these places, every bookstore, every CD store, every DVD store, Best Buy, hanging on for dear life, to see all these places that at one point simply couldn't fail going out of business. To me, it's because they're not realizing, okay, there's an end to this. We have to see where consumer habits are going, and we have to be able to pivot and understand that in order to survive, we need to be able to make money over here, because this money is not going to be there forever. And I think WWE has done a remarkable job of that.
Yeah, they've. I mean, the WWE Network move was, some people thought, premature. And I think, there were people who were looking at, well, a 2-year arc of revenue, going, well, they could have made more if they had stuck with pay-per-views. And they spent a lot of time in front of calculators trying to prove it. And it's like, that's not the point. Right. The point isn't, could you have made more money a year or two over the, 1 or 2 years after the network launched? The point is are they getting in early enough that they're leading the fans towards a new and inevitable way of getting content? I mean, look at, Netflix and Apple TV Plus and Disney Plus. It's not anymore. They knew a la carte at a premium price was going away, was fading. And I mean, there's still UFC pay-per-views and, different big events, but for the most part, they were ahead of the curve on diving in and stopping what was a good deal, which was pay-per-view revenue for WrestleMania. Mm-hmm. And they said, we're going to roll the dice and do this maybe a year or two before it's fully ripe, so that we are at the forefront of this on a large scale. And they risked a lot of revenue in order to do it. But I think it was the right approach. I mean,
I do too.
When you look at where WWE was in going into 2010 revenue wise, I mean, it's so much different now, and a big part of that is they were willing to roll the dice and take that chance on WWE Network and not play catch up with other streaming services. And I think people do see them as a leader. And I think Vince McMahon, on a personal level, yes, he likes a big WrestleMania event, and he likes drawing big crowds, and he likes drawing big ratings. But if he can have a legacy that is this big company that was making all this money on pay-per-view, led the way on the monthly fee, just like Spotify and Apple Music and all this stuff. It's not about buying CDs. You mentioned CD stores. It's about paying a flat fee every month and getting a ton. And they could have waited and let other people figure it out. But I think he takes pride, and he said so, in being ahead of some of the other big players that were nervous or scared to dip into the water as soon as he did.
And I really love that you bring up Disney Plus, that in 2019, kind of the curtain is revealed and we see what Disney's plan was all along, that Disney spent all this time spending all this money buying Marvel and buying Star Wars and buying ESPN and buying all these properties so that they could launch their own streaming service where they weren't going to be making money anymore licensing their movies through Netflix and other streaming services, and they're going to lose all this money that they used to make, putting stuff away in the home video vault and releasing home videos. But all of a sudden, ta-da, we were buying all these licenses, and now they're only available here. Meanwhile, 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago at this point, WWE went, wait a minute, what if we bought up all these beloved wrestling tape libraries, and then a few years ago goes, ta-da, here's what we've been doing. All these tape libraries that we've been buying up, they're not for pay-per-view, they're not for home video release, they're not for anything. For $10 a month, we're just going to open all of them up to you too. And I think that there are a lot of parallels to be drawn.
Yeah, yep, I agree. And I think one of the stories is just Vince McMahon being still in power.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, who would have thought?
If you look back at,
who
closing
would
out 2009, I don't know if people would have thought that he would, that he would stick with. I mean, some people, of course, if he's alive, he's going to be running it. But, there were opportunities for him to scale back or step back in a more public way than he has. And, he doesn't have the perfect streak of attending every Raw and every SmackDown. And, to a degree, age is catching up with him in certain ways. You can hear it on some of the corporate conference calls, that bombastic, I'm in the front, I'm just raising my hand and I'm speaking first. He's more in the background. But he talk to anybody. He is still the dominant creative force. He's got two hands on the steering wheel, and there's no doubt who's in control. And here we are, another full decade of Vince McMahon in that position.
You started PW Torch in what year?
1987.
Who would have thought? If I told you in 1987 that in 2020 we'd be having this conversation about Vince McMahon still absolutely being the guy, there's no way you would have believed it.
Okay, I might have believed it because of his personality, but I'd have been good for him in the sense of here he is in his 70s still doing it.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine looking that far ahead. Yes,
right.
But in '87 it was still in doubt whether he was going to make it to 1990. You know what I mean? Like
sure.
So the idea that he would have the type of revenue that he has is, to do like what do you do? 186 million in the third quarter of 2019, I think, something like that. When you compare that to the revenue that they were doing 10 years earlier, it's crazy. So, but then when you compare it to the revenue in 1987, that is when it was, what main event can we put out there to help us do better numbers at MSG so that we can have a good quarter? It was about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, not tens of millions or even hundreds of millions. It was such a different game. So yes, for him to still be in control at this level is really astounding. But honestly, back in '87, even then it seemed like what we knew about Vince McMahon told us he's going to do this, and he's going to do it until he's not taking breath on this planet. I didn't see him retiring or moving on to other things, even though he wanted to diversify his portfolio at times. He's a wrestling guy, and things worked out enough, even through the Monday Night War challenges and some other challenges and health challenges, that he's still here.
So, as we talk about the 2010s and how it was so WWE dominant, going into this decade, first of all, I think as a fan and creatively, the first few years of this decade, I didn't like at all. I think that WrestleMania 27, which would be a year into the decade, is probably my least favorite WrestleMania of all time. But you could make an argument, and we'll talk about, the best WrestleMania of the decade at some point today, but you could make an argument that one of the WrestleManias of this decade might be my favorite. I think that the juxtaposition between where we started in 2010 and where we went to is probably as big a difference as the 90s for me. And I think that a lot of that has to do, and, the 90s was enormously different. You started, with the sort of new generation cartoony stuff, and you ended up in the Attitude Era. I think that a lot of the difference is that in 2010, when this decade started, I think that the WWE's huge emphasis was on creating their own stars that had never wrestled anywhere significantly. And that's when you saw guys like, obviously that's where a lot of successful people came from, John Cena, Batista, Brock Lesnar, that Randy Orton, even The Miz, like that whole wave of talent. But I don't think that the WWE really hit its stride in this decade until they started, and NXT I think had everything to do with this, but until they opened up the company. I think that in the 2010s, WWE became a much less, halfway through, they became a much less closed off place, closed off to new ideas, closed off to new people. They started to look outward a lot more than I think that they had before. And that's with bringing people in where maybe they would change their name, but they wouldn't change who they are. You know, I think that before Kevin Owens entered WWE, now we almost take for granted that somebody like Kevin Owens would be there. Of course he would be there. He had all this buzz. He was successful on the indies. The natural move is to go to the WWE. But that wasn't the case with Kevin Steen. Like, Kevin Steen was a guy that they were like, well, no, he'll never be in WWE. You know, Sami Zayn had to completely, he was probably the first person of this sort of wave to change things, but he had to completely change everything about who he was outside of the WWE before he got into the WWE. Kevin Owens came in, of course, Finn Balor coming in, and then I think that the wave of guys that came in, the group of 4 that came in from Japan, changed everything too. Not because these were the most impactful people in the world, but because it just changed the way you look at who is a quote-unquote WWE potential superstar and who wasn't. And of course, I mean, when AJ Styles, Shinsuke Nakamura, Carl Anderson, and Luke Gallows all came in from New Japan in one fell swoop, I think that changed everything too. Did you see a difference in this decade of the way WWE at one point was kind of a closed system and then all of a sudden became very, very open?
Yeah, I think that's a real astute point that WWE reacted. Vince McMahon went against sometimes his instincts on the type of wrestler to push because we were sort of in a work rate era. We were in, I know Triple H uttered it once and then I heard regretted it because he didn't like the term and it sort of slipped out, but he called it the reality era. And I'm not crazy about that term because it can mean different things. I think a better term is authentic, in the sense that when you see Kevin Owens, he's not a dentist, he's not a trash man, he's not a hockey player. I mean, the whole Bill Irwin-Goon thing gets overplayed as Duke the Dumpster Drozy and stuff. That gets overplayed because those are just sort of enhancement guys,
right,
to make TV a little more interesting. But nevertheless, it was a very character-driven earthquake, typhoon, and Kevin Owens didn't do any of that. He asked Kevin Steen to Kevin Owens. It was him. It was authentic. It wasn't reality, because even reality TV is not reality. But it was authentic personalities. AJ Styles, there's a swagger, but they didn't dress him up in some crazy outfit.
But that was a key to it too, though. Authentic. You made authentic personalities in the sense that these weren't just okay. We'll just put them in a pair of trunks and it's wrestler A versus wrestler B. AJ Styles, Kevin Owens, these guys came in with specific personalities and characters. The character just happened to be, this is who I am.
Exactly. And that is different. I mean, some of that was going on in the first 10 years of the decade, but it really reached a point where I think a generation of people grew up. And granted, here we are talking about this and we have The Fiend. I mean, it's not like it's gone. The Undertaker still is an iconic figure of this decade. But yes, bringing in wrestlers who were not super tall and they weren't given some sort of cartoonish personality, and they got to bring who they were with them into the brand. And part of that was the internet and YouTube and the WWE and Vince McMahon conceding that they could not hermetically seal their fans in a world that was of information that only fans knew. I mean, Vince McMahon came up in the 70s through when there were territories and you could introduce a wrestler to the fans in the Northeast in the WWF market, and they didn't know what their history was. Some might read the magazines on delay and kind of know, but the magazines were sort of working with them or sort of complicit in finessing anything that didn't look quite authentic or seem suspicious in terms of a personality change or a wrestler shifting their persona. But there was a limit on that information, and I think you fast forward all the way to this decade, and there was a resignation and then an embrace of the idea that fans know who wrestlers are before they arrive. There's a buzz. There are, what's the term now, influencers. There were bellwether fans who would be in the audience, and someone would show up, and they would pop. Taz talked about that on his podcast when he showed up at MSG for the first time, and he walked out with no television exposure and got a huge pop. And it was like one of the great moments of his life, of his career, that people knew him from ECW Vince McMahon at that moment, it had to click. I'm not in control anymore. Someone can't show up and I get to define who they are. And there were always issues. I mean, he was willing to put Dusty Rhodes in polka dots and redefine his character from WCW, and he did it with Harley Race. It's not like he wasn't scared to do that, even when someone was really well known. But when Taz showed up, and by the way, Taz had, says, yeah, and then I got backstage and people said you're doomed, because he wants to make it from scratch. He doesn't want someone to come in and be a big deal. But nevertheless, there's this idea of, okay, if we bring AJ Styles in, people are going to know who he is. Enough of them are that people are going to react to him walking out. And that's going to help the fans who don't know who he is, because there are tons of people, even listening to you, Sam, but who listen to wrestling podcasts, listen to mine, but especially the ones who are at pay-per-views and go, oh, WWE's in town, let's go. Or what's on tonight? Oh, yeah, let's watch Raw this week, even though I haven't in a couple weeks. Those people are going to attach themselves to a degree to wrestlers who the crowds are already reacting to.
Yes.
When they walk out, and they go, oh, this guy must be a big deal. And then they go, okay, I believe this person must have earned that pop that he's getting from these fans who seem to know more than me. So, yeah, WWE embraced that in a way that they hadn't previously, and it is part of defining the decade.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. To me, it was the first time that WWE acknowledged that there was anything in the world outside of WWE since Monday Nitro was on the air. And they did that at first by just allowing elements of people's characters from outside into their characters in WWE. Then they allowed people to keep their names, to the point where now you can turn on the WWE Network and you've got, who was it? Jeff Jarrett, AJ Styles, and I'm blanking on who the third person was, who's sitting there doing a WWE-produced table for three talking about TNA memories when Impact is still in business. It's like, I mean, there's never been anything like that before. When you got multiple WWE Network specials that it's using footage from Impact Wrestling, and that's using, and it's just a conversation about Impact and stuff that had nothing to do with WWE. When you've got, I think the CM Punk DVD was the first DVD that WWE put out that was using not only independent footage, but Ring of Honor footage. And at the end of to me, as a fan that's been a fan for as long as I have, and I'm sure you had a similar experience, it still is mind-boggling to me when those shows go off the air and it says, we'd like to thank, Impact Wrestling for the footage. Go to this network to see all the Impact Wrestling footage. Or thanks to Ring of Honor for supplying us with this footage. Become a Ring of Honor member here or there. And I'm going like, this is, I don't know if people realize how unheard of this was only a few years ago.
Yeah. There was a time where WWE wanted to not even acknowledge the existence that other companies existed. And granted, I don't think they want to talk or even allude to AEW. I suspect there's an edict that got passed down in some form or fashion, just going, we're not going to take shots. We're not going to go to battle. We don't want to make it seem like we're scared of them or that there's concern. 10 years ago, Vince McMahon brought Bret Hart back, and that was huge news because they wanted to counter Hulk Hogan showing up on TNA on Monday night. The WCW war was fresh in their mind, and they said they weren't nervous about it, but at the same time they, with implausible deniability, said, oh no, we'd have had Bret Hart here anyway. But they've been through enough to know we got to counterpunch a little bit. NXT is a move in a similar way, which is, they can sit here with a straight face and say, oh, we would have gone to Wednesday night on USA Network anyway, because, we moved SmackDown to Fox. So it's just really a coincidence. And as Triple H rightfully said, Wednesday night's our night. AEW is the one that's going head-to-head with us. But going live for 2 hours at that time slot, while not overtly, acknowledging it is. And then they put out the press release after they lost the first ratings battle by a wide margin, saying this is a marathon, not a race. And by the way, they were right.
Yeah.
In the closing of the viewership. So in different ways, they acknowledge, while not wanting to fully acknowledge, but to just sort of, like you said, try to be friends with the industry. And part of that is just the confidence that they had, that they had won.
Yes.
And when you win and you have that kind of bank account, that kind of revenue coming in, and that market share and the market recognition and the dominant roster and a feeder system in place, you don't have to be insecure anymore. And you can see that ROH isn't a threat to your pay-per-view numbers or to
Yeah.
your house show attendance. So why not? You
And
know?
I think WWE also gets to a certain place where, and they did this with ECW as well during the Monday Night Wars, when they go, okay, there are certain outside entities that are good for the health of the industry as a whole, which is good for the health of our company. And then there are entities that are seemingly directly trying to compete with us. We can help the entities that are helping the industry as a whole, because that will help us in the long run without going out of our way to help the people that are specifically competing with us. You know, I think that they're probably discerning in that way, as any successful company should be. But I think that the fact that they discern and say, no, there's a lot of wrestling out here that we can kind of give a nod to without it negatively affecting us, I think that's a mark of where WWE has gone.
And I don't think it's done because they're magnanimous and charitable. I think they're doing it pragmatically. And you know, they're thinking our fans know. And if we try to pretend that they don't know, they might look at us as in a different way, as if we're trying to hide something from them. So under the definition that you just laid out, circumstantially, case by case, we're going to not insult our fans by pretending stuff doesn't exist outside of what we do. And there are times where, for the sake of WWE Network, you want to have that footage of AJ Styles early in his career, Samoa Joe early in his career. You want to have that, and so part of it is you know, having better documentaries on WWE Network and the cost-benefit ratio of acknowledging and working with ROH at arm's length, as opposed to not, and then not having that footage. And they're like, what's the harm? And so it's pragmatic to not insult the fans and let the fans who have internet and a certain group who know this stuff exists, and acknowledging it isn't going to be a boost to ROH's business just because you go thanks to ROH. And so WWE just pragmatically looked at the cost ratio and didn't put some weird, outdated pride on the line. They just did what made sense.
And you know, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up Samoa Joe, because I think he's a pretty important figure, especially when you're talking about the second half of this decade. We'll get back to the first half because there are still a couple interesting little points that I think we could make. But when you talk about the second half of the decade, I think that the emergence of NXT as the staple original show on the WWE Network, and then obviously in this last year coming to USA and really taking shape. But I think watching the slow build, I think seeing these takeover shows just redefine certainly WWE as we know it. I mean, it did. I think it made a huge impact on wrestling as a whole, but we have never seen anything in WWE like these takeover shows that have been going on. I also think the fact that Triple H was, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it would seem, given a fairly large level of autonomy over this brand, is pretty unheard of in WWE. And I think it's really, really interesting as one of the stories of the 2010s. You have a guy like Samoa Joe, who I think it's pretty public, was really just brought into NXT to do a couple shows and be an attraction so that they could start touring their brand and get the people that they were trying to get, you know, in front of an audience, more people to watch. The people that they were training that maybe you've never heard of, that they were like, this guy's going to be the next superstar. If we can get him on a show where 2,000 people have showed up because Samoa Joe's going to be on that show, it's invaluable experience for him. Not realizing, wait a minute, Samoa Joe is a guy that we could turn into a star now. I think that Samoa Joe coming into NXT with no pretenses and all of a sudden becoming a WWE superstar, I think that that's the same story that Johnny Gargano has. I think that that's the same story Tommaso Ciampa has, that there's this group of NXT guys that were really just brought in to help push the brand forward, not become superstars themselves, that have become sort of pillars of the WWE, and it's simply been a story of, I think, cream rising to the top.
I think it's the WWE fought it at times. You know, we saw it with Daniel Bryan when it was supposed to be, no, we got to get Roman Reigns positioned to follow up with on John Cena, who's winding down a little bit. We need Roman Reigns. He's the guy we want on the posters. We see Roman Reigns at the end of the opening to Fox broadcast. We see him in all the graphics during NFL games on Fox. And then Daniel Bryan just got over. Like, it just like there's this, you can't stop fans and Daniel Bryan from bonding, and we're seeing it again this week, you know, where he's back and fans are embracing it. They're not seeing it as today's news. he's out there with Miz, making Miz look, and no disrespect to Miz, like 3 times better than Miz is in most other matches, in terms of just running around the ring, hitting hard, having an edge to the wrestling style and the mat wrestling and the counters. Like, it's not a dig at Miz, because Miz is had a good year, a good couple years, but in ring, Bryan takes people to the next level, and fans recognize that. And it was inconvenient timing, roughly 6 years ago when it was going on, and they fought against it. But largely, WWE gets credit for embracing it. The fans decided what they liked to watch. And when you're in row 20 or row, in the second deck looking down, you don't care if somebody's 5'9" or 6'3". What you care about is, do you feel a connection with them? And can they tell a story in the ring that makes a fight look real, where there's movement and dazzling athleticism and an ebb and flow and a roller coaster ride that they can take you on? And the guys who look good when Vince McMahon is standing next to them backstage and he looks up at them and is impressed with the work they've done in the gym, that turned out not to be what most fans sitting 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 feet away from the ring care about. You don't know how tall Daniel Bryan is when he's tearing it up in the ring. And Vince McMahon, well, he's still looking for the guys, 6'1", 6'4". He also found a way to weave into the product in a productive, fruitful way that embraced and stopped resisting the fact that fans are into smaller guys than Vince McMahon had a proclivity to push previously.
Yeah, I think Miz is an interesting one, because I don't think 2019 has been all that great for the Miz, but I think 2017 and 2018, maybe 2016 too, were probably the best 2 to 3 years ever for the Miz. I think the Miz came into his own a lot in this decade, but the beginning of the decade is when the Miz walked in to WrestleMania with the WWE Championship. Probably a poorly timed WWE Championship reign for the Miz. I still think that he should have had another reign right around 2017, 2018. But that was the WrestleMania that I said I was not at all a fan of. That's the WrestleMania that ended with The Rock and your 2 top guys, theoretically, John Cena and The Miz, both getting laid out by this guy who wasn't on TV anymore. But I think that historically speaking, it's a very, very important moment. Not just because, The Rock ended up coming back and having a once-in-a-lifetime and then a second-in-a-lifetime match with John Cena.
Yeah.
I think that even more important than those 2 matches, because I do think that, and people say what they want about those matches, but I think that those 2 matches are very important in the history of WrestleMania, and they are 2 of the big WrestleMania matches. I don't know if they both make top 10, but they're certainly in the top 15 giant WrestleMania matches, important WrestleMania matches to me. I think one of the most interesting things, though, about the whole story of The Rock coming back, of The Rock and John Cena being the headline, is, number one, I think that it brought the WWE concept of a WrestleMania mega match to a whole different level. I think that is why, especially the first one, I would put the first John Cena Rock match absolutely in the top 10 matches of all time, because you talk about building WrestleMania around one match. They have never, even Hogan-Andre, and Hogan-Andre, of course, is certainly above that match on my list of most important matches, but Hogan-Andre did not have one of the biggest movie stars in the world at that time in a match that would be competitive. Not a Lawrence Taylor celebrity type match, but in a real WWE storyline, we're going to have a match. I think even bigger than that is that I think WWE really learned the idea of the part-time superstar through The Rock, and realizing that, wait a minute, if we have The Rock have this one match at Survivor Series and WrestleMania, like, that's okay, but what if we brought him back next year, and what if we put the world title on him at Royal Rumble? What if he was the champion and the champion just wasn't defending the title except for WrestleMania? What if that happened? Would the match get bigger? And they were like, well, I guess this did get bigger. What if we could re-sign Brock Lesnar? What if we could take this same level of thinking and say, okay, Brock, there was a time when we're not signing anybody unless they're going to, work 200 matches a year. But what if we told you could work 6 matches a year and you'll be the top person in the company? Is that something you might be interested in? And Brock said, Yeah, that sounds great, actually. I think that is a big deal. I'm not down on part-time superstars as much as I think some people are, because I think that they deliver when it comes time to deliver. Aside from a very, very select few, Brock Lesnar has almost never not delivered in one of his matches. The Rock delivered in the matches that he was in. I think that generally speaking, part-time superstar Triple H generally delivers. I think bringing Batista back for a storyline in one match delivered. I think the Sting stuff, the Triple H Sting, I don't think was exactly what we were all expecting, but I still think that having Sting back, even if it was just for a couple matches and even if it ended abruptly, I think that Sting having a run in WWE is a net positive. And I personally think that bringing part-time superstars as a thing that WWE does was more often than not a positive thing overall.
Oh, I think so too. I think when you look at the decade, the influence of The Rock, Sam, is so important to where WWE went, even going back to the first story of what on the business side and WWE becoming embraced by mainstream culture, is having the biggest movie star of the decade, having started there. And he's not like, he wasn't out there rah Vince McMahon, WWE, but he respectfully talked about his days there while also prudently, strategically, trying to make it seem like I'm not a wrestler dabbling in Hollywood, and that he did in the years leading into the decade. But for him to come back like he did, I remember when John Cena first mentioned it, and I was like, yeah, why don't you invite, what I mean, like, it felt like inviting people to dinner who would never show up to dinner with you.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, that's nice, but you wanted to pat John Cena on the head and go, yeah, that's a nice thought. That's never going to happen.
It is interesting that you bring that up, because that was, and I don't think, if you look back on it, you might not remember that, but you're 100% right that when John Cena was out there in the media saying stuff about The Rock, if he did that today, we'd go, oh, maybe they're building towards something. But when he did that then, we were all saying, The Rock is never going to have a WrestleMania match against you, John Cena. That's ridiculous.
Yes. It felt, it's like a Packer fan just going, yeah, we're going to have Aaron Rodgers over for Christmas this year. And it's like, well, and if you can't make it this year, come on over next year. It's like, you don't know Aaron Rodgers. What are you talking about? That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It was that ridiculous sounding. And it happened. And part of that was John Cena became big enough. And part of it was, Rock decided it was good for his brand and would be fun. He was at a point where he had enough clout to do something that would be fun. He didn't have to worry about it being a stigma on it. And between The Rock and Brock Lesnar, I think there's a cliff drop when you talk about Sting and Goldberg and other special attractions. But in terms of The Rock and Brock Lesnar, you subtract them from WWE, it dramatically changes the decade.
That's right.
The WrestleMania in 2010 was, yes, Undertaker, Shawn Michaels was felt like a big match to WWE fans.
Mm-hmm.
John Cena, Batista, a big enough match. Bret Hart, Vince McMahon, that's a special, kind of a weird, special attraction match. But it was like sort of a loaded house show. And the next year, same thing, Undertaker, Triple H. Oh, that's a special match.
Yes.
And then there's a gimmicky thing, a Michael Cole and Jerry Lawler, Randy Orton, CM Punk. I don't know if people remember the show for that, but at the time it was like, okay. But Miz and John Cena was that. And then that's when it took off. And that's when it became what is going to be the big special attraction match. So you had Undertaker streak still going on, but then you had 2 years of The Rock. And then you had Brock Lesnar, Undertaker after that.
Yes.
And then you had Lesnar and Reigns and Seth in the Triple Threat, which is a little bit of a drop off, but yeah, Triple H and Sting to kind of give it a little bit of a boost in terms of like, that special attraction vibe that it had, and so they have struggled to keep that up. I think WrestleMania 32 was a bit of a drop off in terms of that feeling with sort of The Rock just showing up as a cameo to do something with Rowan, but otherwise it didn't quite have that same. Unless I'm forgetting something, kind of that same first ever, it was a disappointing Lesnar Ambrose match and Reigns Triple H, which was fine, but again, more loaded house show then, oh my God, can you believe this is happening? But then they got back to it the next year with Lesnar Goldberg and really built around that. So, the WrestleMania becoming defined as a show where what is Vince McMahon going to deliver that's going to feel like a huge special attraction with a match we didn't think we'd ever see. Undertaker, Cena, say what you will about it. At least it was there at 34, and they were still trying to do that. And then, of course, last year it was about a lot of things, but the women headlining and Ronda Rousey. So more often than not in the last 10 years, they've managed, and it started with The Rock, or it got revved up again in a big way with The Rock. And that became what defined WrestleMania, whether it was on a pay-per-view era or the WWE Network era. It was about what can we do to put WrestleMania on a platform higher than anything else, so it doesn't just feel like a loaded house show. And I think just running through that, they succeeded way more often than they came up short.
And I think that The Rock and Brock Lesnar also made Ronda Rousey a possibility. I don't think that Ronda Rousey is signing with WWE, even though she had a much busier schedule than either of those two guys did. I don't think Ronda Rousey is signing with WWE long term if The Rock and Brock Lesnar haven't already done that. And I don't even know if WWE quite knows how to sign Ronda Rousey long term had they not already worked stuff out with Brock Lesnar and The Rock. I think it's a learning process for all parties involved because it's such an atypical thing to what WWE has done historically. This idea that Ronda Rousey would have a limited WWE full-on career where she would be a specialty, but she would also be a superstar that will wrestle at live events and on television, and we can do action figures, and we can do T-shirts, and, she'll be on the Souvenir Cup. And, I don't think that without The Rock and Brock Lesnar that we see what we saw with Ronda Rousey.
Yeah, I think that is true, and it goes back to how important Rock was to what happened to WWE in the years since, in so many ways. Business seeming acceptable for corporations to attach themselves and brand themselves with WWE, but also to define WrestleMania as an event that brings some people back who stray.
Yes.
There's this annual WrestleMania season that WWE wants people to watch all the time. But if you want them to watch equally all the time, you never have a Super Bowl. The NFL just said we don't want that. We don't want people to think week 7 is less important than week 17. Well, you can't do that. You gotta build to something and have a final week where playoffs positioning or a playoff spot is on the line, and then playoffs and a Super Bowl. Of course, that's bigger than week 6 or week 4. And WWE, they're like, please watch us all the time. But if you stray or you're not, tune into WrestleMania. We're going to give you something special. And they have, again, it hasn't worked out with a home run or a grand slam every year, but most of the time, and I think there's a big drop off for Sting and Goldberg, and I think Ronda Rousey's somewhere in between Rock and Lesnar and Sting and Goldberg, but all 5 of them were meaningful special attractions to make WrestleMania seem like it was something special and not a loaded house show.
Yeah, and I also think that it started to allow people to rethink how current superstars were able to kind of elongate careers, especially The Undertaker. The Undertaker is such a valuable character in the WWE. Do we need him all year long, or is it worth it to just have him try to get healthy and once a year come off the shelf and show up at WrestleMania or wherever he's going to show up? I think that sort of redefined how The Undertaker was used in WWE. I also think that now we can talk a little bit more about the streak ending. I think that was a big deal in this decade, the streak ending at WrestleMania 30 with Brock Lesnar. And, I think that there's 2 ways of looking at it. Was it the right thing, or should it not have been done? And I think you have to look at it from perspective. I think from the Brock Lesnar perspective, it was 100% the right thing to do. Brock Lesnar, he was still a big deal. He was still an attraction. But look, leading into that WrestleMania, he had lost to Triple H. He had lost to John Cena. Brock Lesnar was not a killing machine. Brock Lesnar was a guy who might win, but if he won against a big star, the big star was going to get his victory back. He was this guy who, at first, he was almost used to help get other people over, which you can only use so long. And I think that when WWE realized, wait, we can have Brock Lesnar for many years, not just 2 years. We have to rethink how we use this guy. He can't be getting beat over here. The fact that he beat The Undertaker's streak, I think, effectively took away any loss against him. It took away the John Cena loss. It took away the Triple H loss. It made it so he could go in and do the Suplex City stuff with John Cena and really seem like in that third John Cena match that he was going to murder John Cena. And I think it's propelled him in the last 6 years. It's still, there is still gas in his tank that was put there by beating the streak that was not there before he beat the streak. On the other hand, I think that, you might have heard people say, and you know what, The Undertaker is still The Undertaker, and, he's still going to be just as, it's still going to be just as big a deal to have him. And while I think it's still, The Undertaker match is still one of the biggest matches at WrestleMania. And anybody that when Roman Reigns beat The Undertaker, still a big deal. You know what I mean? It still is a big deal, but it's not as big a deal. There was this whatever was put into Brock Lesnar, something was taken out of the mystique of The Undertaker. There is a post-streak Undertaker and a pre-streak Undertaker. Still good on both ends. But one is this entity that will never be stopped, and the other is this entity who at some point we know now will be. I think because of how valuable, in my opinion, Brock Lesnar has been to WWE, I still say that it was a good thing that it happened. As much as I love The Undertaker, and I would love for that character to just exist forever as an undefeated, impossible to beat entity, Brock Lesnar has added a lot, and I don't think he would have added as much had he not beaten the streak. Where do you stand on it?
You make a really good case for endorsing the end of the streak. I think it would be a lot easier call to make against ending the streak if Brock Lesnar weren't still on the roster and hadn't come back.
I agree.
Yeah. I mean, so we're sitting here at the end of 2019 with, the ability to look back and say, okay, knowing what we know now, 5.5 years later, did this work out? And with Undertaker's body breaking down and maybe the lack of can he end the streak type characters for Undertaker to face? I mean, we could sit and do a whole show on what if Undertaker won? And I think we could book a scenario, because Vince McMahon has done this, where it would fuel Brock Lesnar in a different type of way. That would make that storyline would be losing to Taker gave him you can imagine Paul Heyman cutting this promo, gave him an edge and a ferociousness we had never seen, losing on the big stage that way. And he goes on a tear, and people look at Lesnar losing as a defining moment to strengthen him because of how he reacted to it. So, in other words, there's ways you can mitigate some of the loss by how you frame the loss. And I don't think a lot of that was done with Undertaker, with him losing, but they could have done it had Brock lost. So, first of all, it's an easy call. If Brock goes away and you lose out on Undertaker's streak and having a huge moment, the streak versus retirement or streak versus a title, whatever, you can do different things with Undertaker that would have given them a card to play. And I do think they lost significantly. Undertaker against Bray, the next year, it's like something it was like having an empty seat at the dinner table, not having the streak at the WrestleMania dinner table at stake. Shane McMahon was sort of this gimmicky thing. It's like, I mean, I didn't like it conceptually. I
especially because the stipulation was not even remotely paid off.
Yes, exactly.
Like, why even have it?
I know. So, but even going in, I'm like, Shane shouldn't be presented in the narrative of WWE storytelling as a threat any more than I would on some courtroom drama as a non-lawyer walking in and being able to defend my client against a prosecutor who's won every case in over 30 years. Why would I, as some layperson walking in a courtroom, be able to even compete with him? I don't even know the law. And Shane being portrayed as someone who could handle Undertaker for more than a minute or 2 or 5 minutes, I thought was just ludicrous on the face of it. And I understand you can go back, well, Shane competed with Kurt Angle. Well, I thought that was ludicrous too. But still, I don't just give in on that one. But I know, but it felt like a special attraction. They put big stakes. It's a McMahon. Shane's going to take big bumps, and he did, and I get that. And it turned into a spectacle that I think satisfied a lot of fans. But was it the same as the streak? No way.
No, it was it was about number one, Shane McMahon is back. Oh my God, I never thought this would happen. Because and that's a story, because I think people were so ready to see Shane McMahon leave TV again recently.
Yeah.
I don't think that people remember middle of the decade what a huge deal it was for Shane McMahon to return. Nobody saw it coming. It was a shock for everybody. Nobody thought he would ever be back. Nobody thought he'd ever be back in wrestling in general. So to see him not only come back, to see him have a match at WrestleMania, and then to see him extend his stay past WrestleMania was a huge story. But yes, you're right about the fact that it wasn't the same, that we were now looking at something where we're being given an excuse to tune in because I think Shane McMahon is going to jump off the Hell in a Cell, which is an attraction, but it's not the same as the streak. You're right.
Yeah. And then you had a more broken down Undertaker. So this sort of mitigates the argument for keeping the streak alive because he just physically was showing real signs of wear and tear. And understandably, there's no shame in that. And so, Reigns and Undertaker headline, no holds barred. And it's, big moment for Roman Reigns to get that win. But what if Roman ended the streak, he would have had even more heel heat.
Yeah, he would have been a bigger heel than Brock Lesnar. Yeah.
Yeah, but had Roman Reigns lost to Undertaker at 33 and the streak continued, there might have been some goodwill. Like, wow, Reigns was getting pushed to the moon. Everyone thought Reigns is going to beat Undertaker, and this is Vince McMahon showing the fans Roman is the true, christened top star, and you're going to like him, damn it. And instead, he sort of magnanimously was booked to do the job, and he earns Undertaker's respect through a hard-fought battle. Does Reigns come out of that stronger? And then you can play the streak card the next year and maybe lure Undertaker into an action, or lure both John Cena and Undertaker into a full-fledged, it's the last match on the show, both men putting something at stake. You don't even need something at stake for that. And you do a full-fledged match and you build Mania around that more than Lesnar Reigns. And could you have pulled that off? Would that have meant more? And again, this is just with the lineups they delivered. They might have done completely different lineups had that finish been different for Lesnar Taker. But just looking at the way things played out, Taker Cena means a lot more if there's still a streak. And Cena can cut some great promos about he's accomplished so much, but if he's the guy to end the streak, that's a defining moment in his career, and he will help Undertaker up and raise his arm. And but Cena needs to prove he wants to be known as the wrestler of this era, and he can't be known as that with the streak hanging over his head and Undertaker defining each WrestleMania. Cena can say, more than my matches, people talked about the streak. The only way to change that is to beat him. That becomes perhaps a WWE Network subscriber surge, because it feels so much more historical than whatever the heck it was that they ended up doing. So, I can build a case either way, and I don't think it was a disaster, but I don't think it was, in retrospect, that had they not done it, they would have been noticeably worse off. I really think there was a significant loss, despite the physical limitations of Taker, by having him lose. So I hate to hedge, and it's more fun in a debate for me to take a strong opposite side. You made a compelling case. I can make a case the other way, that Lesnar would have been just fine because he's so freaking talented. And Taker was getting near the end of his physical capabilities, and he needed the streak to stay for his matches to seem more relevant. I think Lesnar could have rehabilitated himself just fine with Paul Heyman on the mic and Lesnar's physical imposition, his imposing athleticism and look. And Taker sort of needed the streak because he was fading age-wise, physically, to stay relevant. So I'm kind of talking myself into endorsing the streak staying alive, knowing what we know now.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, depending on your perspective, you could easily make the argument either way.
Well, I'm glad you admitted you were wrong, then.
That will never happen. What was your favorite WrestleMania of the last 10 years?
I wish I had sat down and ranked them.
We should have done that. The way we rank every WrestleMania, we should at some point rank, because I didn't rank them either. I have my favorite, and I know I have 4 that I think were specifically good, and then I have my favorite.
Like I'm a, I do this for a living and have for so long, and I'm embarrassed at like the fact that in my brain, because it's just so much gets fed at me every day, every week that I'm processing and reporting on and talking about and podcasting about. It's hard. It is hard. It's hard for me to like, and I used to do more of it when I do yearbooks, like in the 90s. It was usually over holiday break. I'd like sit down and just immerse myself. Hey, family, I'm going to be in my office. And I would like reflect on the year, or I would, even do it later into the year and reflect on the previous year. We don't do that enough anymore. And if I had only watched 10 WrestleManias, I could rattle them off these last 10. But I've seen all of them. So
right. Yeah.
I don't. It's not at my fingertips. Like I can think about the big matches, but in terms of the totality of the entertainment value and reflecting on it, I'm not good at that. I'm sorry.
So I'm thinking about how I felt coming off of it. I can't defend. I can't even name every match on these shows, but I certainly can't defend every match on these shows. But for me, I thought WrestleMania 30 was the best by far. And I think that's because I think Daniel Bryan winning the championship at WrestleMania 30 might be the best moment of the entire decade. I think it ranks there. You never thought when I was growing up anyway, there's something about moments that happen when you're a kid that you feel like, well, those are the moments and there won't be anymore. Once you become an adult, it's almost like you stop considering moments as classic. They're just, I guess it's like you just said, it's because you're consuming so much stuff that when you're younger, everything seems more slow and paced out and memorable, and now it's just everything's hitting you so fast and you're maintaining everything you knew before that it's crazy.
And you're stuck in class.
Yeah.
And your mind wanders to wrestling. When
Yes.
you're at school.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're drawing little logos
like
on. Yeah. You're.
Exactly. You think you're taking notes from the teacher, but you're really ranking WrestleMania. Yeah.
Yeah. When I'm learning Roman numerals from WrestleManias, those are the WrestleManias. Yeah. So I think that the WrestleMania 30 Daniel Bryan winning the championship moment ranks right up there with, the classic moments for me are Hogan body slamming Andre, are Warrior holding up the 2 titles and Hogan going away, are, probably after that you might end up going maybe Shawn Michaels, but that was a little bit of a created moment. I don't know if that was quite. You might have to go all the way up to, I guess, Stone Cold winning the title, The Rock and Hogan. There's a handful of real, classic, memorable, this is WrestleMania folklore. This is what WrestleMania is made of. And Daniel Bryan winning the championship at WrestleMania 30 is 100% one of those moments. It was fan service, but it was the best story of the entire decade. It was organic. It was, you could never, at a different time with a different superstar, it could never happen again for many, many reasons. And so for me, that was my favorite WrestleMania.
Yeah.
I thought WrestleMania 31 in Palo Alto was also very, very good. But I think that is actually because it defied expectations so much. I think that Triple H versus Sting did not live up to, I think, what people expected it to be. But beyond that, I think that, you go back to Daniel Bryan and that ladder match, I think set up the standard for what those WrestleMania ladder matches could be. And Bryan at the top of that ladder with the Intercontinental Championship took something that you go, wait a minute, this guy who had the WrestleMania moment last year, now he's in the opening match. I don't remember it that way. I remember it as okay, I believe in Daniel Bryan again. And then really, it's all about what the main event was. Having Seth Rollins lose to Randy Orton in a spectacular way with the RKO coming off of the curb stomp, and then going into the main event with everybody with their, hands under their butts going, I don't want to see this. I'm mad that Brock Lesnar beat the streak last year, and I hate Roman Reigns. I don't want to be here anymore. And then to have Seth Rollins come out and again deliver the moment that everybody truly wanted is that, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I remember it. And Rollins, it's everything that Rollins winning the title this year should have been. It's that sort of, that's the Seth Rollins moment. And for me, those moments mean the world. I also do think WrestleMania 33 33 in Orlando and 34 in New Orleans were very good. I think New Orleans, these WrestleManias have gotten so long that I think it gets unfair because people just remember them as being very long. Yep. But I think that Ronda Rousey...
We were complaining about WrestleMania 30 being too long. Little did we know.
Little did we know how good we had it. I think Ronda Rousey and her debut in New Orleans and defying expectations the way she did made that WrestleMania for me. And I think that WrestleMania 33 in Orlando was just a great sort of outdoors, giant entry ramp, just making WrestleMania look like a big show. The Hardy Boys return. There was so much about that WrestleMania that really felt like a real classic Super Bowl WrestleMania that I loved that one too.
Yeah, no, you've made a good case for a lot of them. I mean, WrestleMania 30. I know I reviewed it at the time very positively, and the idea of having a show that just start to finish succeeded in so many different ways, including rebounding from the kind of emotional shock of the streak ending.
Mm-hmm.
And they met, the crowd was sort of like in shock after that for a while.
Yeah.
And then Daniel Bryan and comes out, and I don't know if there's many people who could have gotten that crowd back the way that they did. But that was such a moment for fans who wanted to see a symbol of management getting behind Daniel Bryan, who they loved. And just Daniel Bryan beating Triple H to kick off the show,
yes,
in a long match. I mean, that in the opening segment with Hogan and Austin and Rock, hey, this is WrestleMania. We're bringing together, a Mount Rushmore gathering
in the Silverdome.
Yes, it felt historically significant. Totally.
Yes.
And and at the time, even Bray Wyatt, it felt like it was a big deal to have, for Bray to be in there with John Cena. It felt like that might be an accelerant for him to become a top star. And then you had the Shield intact, against kind of a legacy act. And so there was a lot of star power, and just it wasn't a show filled with like 4.5-star matches or even necessarily a runaway match of the year contender, but the whole show felt bigger than the sum of its parts. And so, yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, that's at the top of the list. But you can absolutely make a case, as you did for next year's Mania 31. And that felt like, what are they going to do now without a streak? And it wasn't an Undertaker streak-centric event, but Bray was a good character to kind of rebound. But yeah, the Seth moment, and then seeing Sting, the one guy, and again, I think it's not nearly as, in totality, not nearly as significant as Rock or Rousey or Lesnar in terms of Sting's influence. But when you're looking to keep the WrestleMania brand alive the year after the streak ends, having Sting come in, setting aside what they did in the match, I think that meant a lot to a lot of fans.
And by the way, WrestleMania 31 was the WrestleMania where they had their first in-ring interaction with Ronda Rousey and The Rock and Triple H and Stephanie. And that was, as weird as it was to have that sort of segment in the middle of WrestleMania where there's no match and it's taking forever, it was a very good segment, and it was a segment that I think everybody remembers. And I don't think that anybody realized would be so historically significant as it was.
It checked a lot of boxes that make a WrestleMania seem like, okay, that felt, again, like way more than a loaded house show, way more than a really good pay-per-view. It just, again, a really good main event, and I think that's super important. To end WrestleMania without an exhausted crowd, and an engaged crowd, and which feels like the culmination, and not people checking their watch, just going, am I going to get on the subway before they shut down for the night? You don't want that. But the special appearances, some really, really good in-ring wrestling. And then, Ronda Rousey, Sting, a Money in the Bank cash-in that you knew people would talk about for years.
I think up until that point, Edge probably was most defined with that briefcase, that when you thought of the briefcase, you thought of Edge. Mm-hmm. I think that moment made it so that Seth Rollins is the most important and memorable Money in the Bank cash-in superstar.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree. But go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, who do you think owns the decade? So,
Okay.
I mean, you can talk about moments and you can make arguments for that. You could talk about, we don't talk about Sheamus when we talk about this decade, but he spent the first half of maybe not the first couple years of the decade winning just about every title imaginable. But it did slow down pretty early on, so I don't think you could really make a case for that. But who do you think? Because, interestingly enough, I think the default response would be John Cena, but we've been talking about the 2010s for over an hour now, and we have not talked about John Cena almost at all. Here and there he's come up.
Yeah.
But we haven't really talked about him that much. And I think one of the most significant things John Cena did in the 2010s, first of all, it was to be the star in WWE when they didn't have stars. I think that's a thankless position that John Cena carried WWE through all those years before The Rock was there, before Brock Lesnar was there. All those times that we were saying, when WrestleMania didn't quite feel like WrestleMania, John Cena was the guy that it's like, okay, at least we got John Cena. And I feel bad that John doesn't get more credit for that because I think he deserves it. But I think that probably the most significant thing all decade that John Cena did was leave. And I don't mean that as a thing that like he made it better when he left, because I don't think he did. I think John Cena, especially towards the end of his, run, was incredible. And I think that I would if John Cena were coming back today, I would say this is tremendous news. I can't wait to see who he's going to be in the ring with. I would love for John Cena to be back wrestling a one-off, full-time, whatever he wanted to do. I think it would be a net positive. But I think that the idea that he created a John Cena-less WWE opened up the world. And I talked about this a little bit on the Thursday update when I called John Cena one of the most influential performers in WWE of 2019, because I think the influence of him not being in the company changed everything.
Yeah. I mean, the decade of Cena was, 2005.
Yes, that's why, it doesn't quite line up with what we're talking about, but yes.
No, yeah, I mean, you look at last year, not there.
Mm-hmm.
The year before, whatever that was with Undertaker. And, then the year before that, it was when you still felt like what's Cena going to do at WrestleMania? And at 33, it was the mixed tag match that felt like, well, is this more to like placate Nikki or like what's going on here? Is this about reality television? It felt even then he was stepping aside, even though he was involved in the hype in a major way. You go back to 31 and it was Rusev for the U.S. title.
Right.
And I mean, that was cool. Cena's whole U.S. title thing is part of what we will talk about as John Cena's contributions to the decade is the whole U.S. title open challenge. And then before that, it was Bray Wyatt, which was sort of like, okay, Bray's on the rise and Cena's still a top star. He's in a star-making position now. But that's the second half of the decade right there in terms of WrestleMania contribution.
I never thought about that until you just laid it out. John Cena didn't main event a WrestleMania after The Rock, did he?
Nope.
Wow. Isn't that wild to think about?
Yeah, it is. I mean,
wow.
And I want a book to be written someday. And, I want someone to say, what was there, and not a scandalous moment or a falling out, but like, how did that transition take place internally where Vince and Cena both on the same page and Vince and Cena are both about to talk at the same time and they laugh and they go, are you thinking what I'm thinking?
Yeah.
And it's like, I think we are. It's time for me to step down from main eventing and I want to help you out with special attract. Or was it something else where all of a sudden Cena, because he hinted at this in interviews and we weren't sure what to make of it. Like, well, they didn't really call me and ask. And, like it felt like there was some passive aggressiveness on Cena promos sometimes that was very strategically. Cena doesn't say things by accident. It felt like it was open for interpretation of, well, maybe he's trying to seem gracious and not be a drag, but does he feel a little bit like Bret Hart, who said, "Oh, he rides you until, and he rides you like a horse until you can't ride you anymore, and then he just cards you and moves on." Like, there's veterans who have talked like that. Did Cena go through that phase and passive aggressively hint at it but not show it? But the bottom line is hugely influential the first 5 years of the decade, and absolutely it has been more of an ensemble. I think the last 5 years is defined by Cena being off to the side while there was this battle between Vince McMahon and the fans over whether they wanted to go through another 10 years, 2015 to 2025, of Roman Reigns in the same position. Or were fans going to be more vocal and say, no, we want to pick the guy, and we don't hate Roman Reigns, but we're going to let you know we're not pleased with his push because we see it as displacing something we want instead. And that's where Daniel Bryan, comes into the picture in a big way. I don't think there's a singular wrestler of the decade in WWE, but I think Brock Lesnar ranks higher than John Cena in that regard. When you think about the big moments that stand out, ending the streak, and being the go-to guy for a longer stretch of time during that decade.
I mean, he certainly took over. Yeah, I mean, Cena had a good 4, and then Lesnar took over the 6.
Yeah.
So it is. I mean, you could, if you want to, he was in WWE and then out of WWE, but I would say most of the reason he would be in the conversation is because of his outside of WWE. Well, maybe both. You could make the argument that Chris Jericho is the wrestler of the decade. Just based on how he redefined what he is and who he is. I mean, just, the fact that he had the runs, the various runs that he had in WWE, into New Japan, into being a pillar of AEW, which I don't think anybody saw. Well, I don't think anybody saw coming long term. I think when it was closer to time, people might have seen it coming. But longer, if you had said that a few years ago he'd be doing that, you wouldn't have seen it coming. I think Chris Jericho could be on the list. I think Roman Reigns is definitely on the list. I think Roman Reigns
no pun intended.
Yeah, right? I think Roman Reigns is probably, for me, the person who ends up owning the decade. I mean, if you talk about a guy who weathered storms throughout the decade of the 2010s, it's Roman Reigns. This is a guy, because the Shield, as short as they lasted, the Shield is surely the most influential group, the most important grouping of superstars to come through this decade. I mean, you look at, they show up out of developmental, and you end up having Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, and Dean Ambrose, who across the wrestling world now are making, I don't think we've seen an impact that big since the Clique separated, without using too much hyperbole. But I think that Roman Reigns, because of the roller coaster that he's been on, you can go back to Philadelphia and the Royal Rumble and just the whole world letting him know you are not our pick, and him having to go through this uphill battle. I think that we're leaving the 2010s with a different level of respect for Roman Reigns than has ever existed. And I don't think that has... I think that it coincides with the fact that he went away with cancer and then came back. And I think that him going away, cancer or no cancer, just the fact that he left gave people an appreciation for him in the sense that it allowed us to all take a step back and go, you know what, we're booing him because it's what we're supposed to do. But Roman is the man. I think that when he shook Keith Lee's hand, for example, at Survivor Series, I think that there was a time when, had Roman done that, people would have booed him and said, we like Keith Lee more than you. He should be the one shaking your hand. I think we've developed this respect for Roman Reigns that makes it so that he is the guy. When Roman Reigns did that, it worked. When Roman Reigns shook Keith Lee's hand, we as fans all sat there and said, oh, we need to keep an eye on Keith Lee because the guy just told us that he is the guy, and it was effective. I think that because, and by the way, Roman, we should mention, in this decade, Roman started out in the Shield and was, for a period of time, the most popular person in the Shield. I mean, Roman was cheered in the Shield. People loved Roman Reigns.
Yeah.
People, when the Shield was intact and they weren't the biggest, like when they were on the rise, people adored Roman Reigns. So to go from being the cool breakout on the Shield to being the most hated guy in wrestling, to finally getting over that hump and being kind of acknowledged, not just by the WWE, but by the fans as kind of the man, I don't think that I don't think that anybody had a decade like Roman Reigns. I think that Daniel Bryan is probably my close second, just because of, you talk about roller coasters, the idea that he redefined how a person can quote unquote get over. He you know, the idea that he went on the journey that he went on. Injuries. We all thought his career was over for a year and a half, 2 years, however long it was. And then to have him come back, and then to have it be okay, not great, okay, and to have him redefine himself as a performer, turn heel, and the fact that he was gone doesn't even come up in conversation anymore. Like, it's not, it's oh yeah, I forgot. He was gone for a long time, and we did think his career was over, and we did all miss him. His character work was so strong as that planet's champion Daniel Bryan that even now that he's a good guy again, we don't think about the fact that he was gone. We don't think about any of it. We just take him as the main eventer that he is, and it's pretty remarkable. So I would put Daniel Bryan as my close number 2, but I think Roman is my number 1 guy.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I'm thinking, if we flip the decade around, should we talk more about John Cena? And because, you know, I want to not weigh the second half at 70% or 80%. I want to do 50. If we're going to do decade, we should do 50-50.
Yes.
So is Undertaker bigger than Roman Reigns? And if we don't look at the where we are today and think about where it sets us up for the 2020s, certainly Roman Reigns means more to the next few years than Undertaker. But Undertaker's decade started out against Shawn Michaels, headlining WrestleMania in a match that is going to be, for many people, their favorite match ever, or the match that made them a wrestling fan, or that made them see Undertaker in a light they had never seen before, and made them go back and immerse themselves in Shawn Michaels' body of work if they hadn't lived through it in real time.
Yeah.
And then 2 Triple H matches that were I won't say off the charts good, but you know, they were at the top of the charts good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Those were tremendous. And then, you know, CM Punk match, which was, you know, fine, and, you know, whatever. I mean, we can discuss historically what that means. And then the streak ending. The biggest match of the decade was that moment, or the biggest moment of the decade was that moment. And we all can know where we were and how we felt when that happened. And it's not like he went away. You know, you still had Bray Wyatt. You had the Shane McMahon match. So you had the Cena moment. I mean,
no, it's a strong case. It's a very, very strong case.
Yeah. So to me, you look at that and then you go, well, but maybe Brock Lesnar, on that criteria, maybe Brock means more, should be in that conversation. And then you look at the first half of the decade with John Cena and being out there every week on TV. And every week Undertaker wasn't, Lesnar wasn't. Reigns spent a good part of the time in a faction, and then I won't say failing as a top attraction, but coming up short of being embraced by the fan base to the point that it was embarrassing at times. I mean, it was embarrassing for WWE to have the announcers in one universe and then the sound. It was like gaslighting people.
That's true.
Like, the announcers were saying Roman Reigns the most popular superstar they love, and the crowd is booing, and that went on for years. And it was like kind of the very definition of gaslighting. What the announcers would do, they're like, but there's no, that they're not, you know, you're hearing something that we're not hearing. So there were asterisks there. And I agree with you where Reigns is now. And I think that people look back at what went wrong with Reigns, and he was part of it. But he was also, and I go back to a quote I think was on your show, I do what I'm told and I hope to get rich. And Reigns was the guy who's like, there's a machine here. And
yeah, I mean, when you talk about the decade, I had no idea that my show, who would have thought my show would turn Roman Reigns heel? I had no.
But I'm saying this in his defense.
Yes.
No, I don't think he should have said it. I think there's things that are true that you just shouldn't say. You shouldn't volunteer it. But there is sort of a, like, this is a machine, and I am a cog in it. And when I show up, I haven't put in the time. I'm at the gym, and I'm with my family, and I'm thinking about other stuff. You know, I mean, this isn't a dig at Roman, but he's overtly said, like, he attempted to build furniture as a career before it crossed his mind to become a wrestler. He said he'd rather be an NFL star than a wrestler. His family business is wrestling, And it was almost a last resort for him. When you look at his biographical path, like furniture building came. So he wasn't, so he wasn't a guy who was eat, sleep, breathe, talk wrestling. So he was a guy who showed up, and it doesn't sound like it, but it's a defense of him. As a guy who isn't Stone Cold Steve Austin, who grew up loving wrestling and can just talk wrestling nonstop with anybody about anything that's fascinating, wants to be a sponge for more information, loves it, and grew up watching it and loving it. With Reigns, it was sort of like the family thing that got handed down, that he sort of tried other things before he went to it. And so he did seem like a vessel that was filled by Vince McMahon. And fans saw it for that. They saw him as the corporate replacement for John Cena, who hadn't paid his dues in the eyes of many fans. He was the guy who was cool, but knew his place with Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins, who paid their dues on the indie scene. Roman seemed to know his place in the Shield. He's the cool guy standing behind, Diesel to Shawn Michaels. He's a cool guy standing back there. Quote, he knows his place. When all of a sudden Vince pushed him as a singles guy, when you had the Daniel Bryan thing happening at the same time, it's not fair to Joe, the person, Roman, the person. He didn't do anything wrong. He showed up and hoped to get rich and did what he was told. But the circumstances were such where it was ripe for him to be rejected by a significant part of the fan base. And then when the fans saw the announcers weren't acknowledging it and Vince was gonna push back harder, the fans pushed back even harder and all that. I don't think that should be a wrestler of the decade. When you have that kind of conflicting signals and battle going on with your own fan base, a tug of war and a struggle, even if it ended, you say all's well that ends well, and it's landed in a pretty good place for him right now, but he isn't. There's still some dread that he's going to be the guy who beats The Fiend, and the 2020s is going to be the decade of Roman Reigns. And you have this, it's like what's old is new again. Now you have Daniel Bryan as an alternative at the same time as people looking at maybe Roman getting the win. Will it work better this time around if Vince goes that route? Maybe. But with Daniel Bryan, as you just led into this, now it's like that, he's still here. He's never gone away, and we love him. We could end up seeing a weird replay of history. So I'm not ready to christen Roman as my number one, because I think it's an ensemble. And I think if we look at the first half of the decade, you've got to have more talk about Undertaker and Cena. Jericho's intriguing, but I would have wanted him to have more significant WrestleMania. And I'm not just talking WWE wrestler decade. Yeah. Overall, you can make your case for him in the discussion. But to be in the fourth or fifth match at a couple WrestleManias, a Fandango match, a disappointing Kevin Owens match, I think what Jericho has done is amazing for himself. And his body of work in New Japan and what he did just at the very end of the decade with AEW, I think doing his best work in the ring, in some ways carrying AEW Dynamite in the personality development and talking department at a time when we thought it would be an ensemble with Moxley and more Cody and some surprises. I mean, it's great. I just don't think his role in the biggest company of the decade was significant enough, consistently enough to leapfrog Taker, Lesnar, Reigns, Cena, or whoever else I just left off. Brian, thank you. Yeah, Daniel Bryan. I knew there was somebody else.
I agree, and I agree with you. There's an interesting, and by the way, Cody should be on the list. Just because of not just for AEW, but the way he left WWE, the list that came out, the whole thing, it redefined a lot of things for a lot of people. Not that he would be anywhere near the top or anything, but just somebody that it deserves mentioning. And there's on that note, on our way out,
Mark Henry 10 years ago this week on Raw, that's where he was.
Say that again.
He beat Mark Henry on Raw 10 years ago this week.
Wow.
So that's he in other words, he was around for 10 years.
Right. And there's a very interesting photo that's been around since it came out. Everybody's seen it, I'm sure. But I don't know if you've taken a look at it recently. It's from 2012, and I think it's from 2012. And it's all the champions at the time together. And it's when there had been a whole bunch of title changes, and it was really supposed to signify a changing of the guard. It's CM Punk as WWE champion. Beth Phoenix has the Divas title. There's one tag team title that's held by Kofi and Evan Bourne. Cody is the Intercontinental Champion. Zack Ryder is the United States Champion. And Daniel Bryan is the World Champion at the time before, and ironically enough, it's when he's got his head shaved and, he's got short hair and he's doing the no stuff. Yes. It's just kind of starting. It's before Daniel Bryan is Daniel Bryan. But it's really interesting because there was a time when I would look at that photo and say, well, that didn't pan out, did it? Because, what are these guys really doing? But when you really look at it and you look at what the decade meant, it's interesting that you talk about CM Punk and something that at the time was so significant ends up really just being a news story. I don't know that it impacted everything one way or the other, to tell you the truth. I do think it's interesting that you get to the end of the decade and CM Punk is coming back. I think his podcast with Colt Cabana is probably more influential on the podcast wrestling world than him leaving WWE was on the wrestling world as a whole. But CM Punk still extremely significant. Daniel Bryan, as I've said, he's in my conversation for wrestler of the decade. Zack Ryder, Zack Ryder's still Zack Ryder, unfortunately for him. Kofi Kingston, obviously. I think the New Day can also be talked about as one of the significant forces in the 2010s. Again, that's more the second half of the 2010s, but there's a huge story in the New Day. And Kofi's moment at WrestleMania, I think you could put on that list of classic WrestleMania moments. I think we got 2 amazing WrestleMania moments last year. But Kofi, I think more influential or a bigger deal than any of us would have realized until recently. Evan Bourne's Evan Bourne. Beth Phoenix, being a Hall of Famer and coming back and being commentary, just interesting that she's in the photo. And, of course, Cody turning into what Cody turned into. As it turns out, Punk, Bryan, Kofi, Beth, and Cody, all very significant names still in wrestling as we close out that decade. Probably, maybe save for Punk. Beth is a Hall of Famer now, so maybe just save for Punk. All of them much more significant names now than they were even when they took the photo. So just interesting to look back on that now.
We talk in groups of 10 years, but, we go back, 9 or years or whatever for that photo, or 7 years, excuse me. And you think what photo today could be looked at in 6, 7, 8 years in the way that one is.
Yeah.
And who would be in that photo? And is it, and again, if we do cross promotion, is Kenny Omega in that? You look at NXT. Which NXT? Is it Gargano? Is it Cole? Is it Keith Lee? Is it Matt Riddle? Is it Velveteen Dream, who's sort of a little off the radar? It's amazing we've had, this NXT versus AEW battle, and we haven't had Velveteen Dream
right
in the mix yet. And they're doing well. So, yeah, like who is going to be the sort of sneaks up on you unexpected wrestler of the decade contender in, 6, 7, 8 years, who you could take a photo of now with a title and say, yeah, that's the next generation.
And we should have talked a lot more, by the way, about the women's evolution and the sort of the women's movement, I think, is more fitting, in the way that the women's wrestling came up, and the fact that, Charlotte, I think, is going to go down as an Hall of Famer. Hall of Famer. The rise of Becky Lynch. All that stuff happened in the second half, for sure, of this decade, but still a very, very key part to the 2010s, I think. But we've already been going for over 90 minutes. Well, go ahead.
10 years ago, Kelly beat Maurice in a 1-minute match on Raw.
Exactly. I think that the story of the transition of the divas into the women is one of, if not the biggest stories of the 2010s, for sure. And I think that it probably deserves its own show entirely. But there's a lot more content that people can get to, not only through all the channels here at Not Sam Wrestling, the YouTube channel, the podcasts that come out twice a week, but everything going on at PW Torch. Wade, you've been creating content for, I guess, 30 years at this point, over 30 years at this point. You're making it all available to people, just like we were talking about, and you've got a special deal, I've heard, for the Not Sam Wrestling listeners.
You heard the rumor. Yeah.
Yes, I've heard.
So, first and foremost, most people listening aren't going to sign up for VIP membership. No matter how cheap I make it, they're going to just get free stuff. And you're welcome to do that. Just search Wade Keller in your podcast app. We'd love to add you as a listener. We do post shows every Monday night, right after Raw, right after Dynamite. We'll mix some NXT in there too. And every Friday after SmackDown. If you search Wade Keller, click on the red logo, you can download those shows. They're available afterwards. You can also stream them live at wadekellerpodcast.com. And then we also have another feed, which is our flagship and our interviews and our mailbags, and that'll pop up as a blue logo. So please check them out. I think you'll like if you liked our conversation today. I talk like this, 5 times a week, sometimes more. So check that out. Just search Wade Keller in your podcast app. But yeah, you can get our archives, and you can get all those shows I just talked about ad-free, and then also get a ton of other exclusive shows from me and my team on a daily basis with a VIP membership. And yeah, you can go back to the late 1980s back issues. You can read like my match every SummerSlam. I reviewed every single SummerSlam, almost every WrestleMania match. You can see our roundtable reviews from the Torch staff. Go through our contemporaneous coverage. What did we say at the time when all this stuff was happening? March through over 1,600 back issues of the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter when you sign up in PDF and all text format. Podcasts, including roundtable reviews of just about every WrestleMania we've done, either a retro show predating 2004 or 2005 and on when we started doing post-WrestleMania podcasts. And actually every WWE pay-per-view, there's an hour or so roundtable discussion on it. So yeah, when Sam says you can just dive in and relive any era and hear us talk about it the night of the event or when the news broke, that is true when you go VIP. So you can get a 1-month VIP membership just because you're a Sam listener at pwtorchvipinfo.com. That'll tell you more about membership, pwtorchvipinfo.com. And on the sign-up form, there's a coupon code. Just enter not VIP. Enter NOTVIP in honor of Sam, and we'll take $9.49 off any subscription. So what that means is a 1-month sub becomes 50 cents.
Oh my gosh.
3-month sub becomes $18. So it's like $6 a month. So that's the lowest rate we basically offer ever. All I ask is if you've taken advantage of a sale in the last 6 months, like, you know, a big discount, just sign up again. We'd love to have you, but pay regular price. But if you haven't checked out what we're doing lately, we've got new podcasts, weekly shows on dedicated to the NWA, to Ring of Honor, to the British wrestling scene, to the Japan scene. Check out what we're doing and get on board for the WrestleMania season for 50 cents for a month. That's pwtorchvipinfo.com. Coupon code not VIP.
Not VIP. I mean, what a value. You heard it. Thank you so much for giving of your time so generously, Wade Keller. I really appreciate your insight, man.
Sam, it's such a blast talking to you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Follow at Notsam on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube.
Rate, review, and subscribe. This has been Notsam Wrestling.